I'll start with my presentation. The ILO Centenary Declaration for the Future of Work, adopted in 2019, reaffirms that achieving social justice requires further developing a human-centered approach which puts workers' rights and the needs, aspirations, and rights of all people at the heart of economic, social, and environmental policies. 3.5 years later, after a pandemic and in the midst of multiple crises, decent work deficits have grown or have been exposed, and the promotion of labor rights is more central than ever. So let me first take you through some data that highlight some of the decent work deficits that persist in the BRICS. First, there are deficits in terms of the quality of the employment created. This slide highlights two indicators. On the left-hand side, the proportion of informal employment in total employment by sex, which shows the high level of employment in the informal economy from 1/3 of workers in Brazil to 9 out of 10 in India. On the right-hand side, the graph shows the working poverty rate, which is the percentage of employed people living below $190 in purchasing power parity a day. And this graph shows that too many workers still do not earn enough from their work to keep themselves and their families out of poverty. Second, discrimination in respect of employment and occupation remains an issue. Women's employment rate continues to be far lower than men, as shown in the left-hand chart on the slide. It is not shown here, but occupational segregation still prevails, with women employed more than men in low-paying jobs. And on the right-hand side, I've put a graph on the gender wage gap. And although it is at different levels in the 4 countries for which we have data, this gender wage gap remains significant. Discrimination on other grounds than sex is also prevalent, although for the sake of time, I didn't present data on this here. In terms of working time, many workers in the BRICS still work excessive hours beyond 48 hours a week, as shown on this chart. Many workers in the BRICS are not covered by collective agreements, up to 70% in Russia and India. Trade union density is also low, as you can see with the blue bars on this chart. So taken together, these indicators show that workers' voice is not very strong at the moment. Let me now turn to the main recent ILO frameworks on labor rights and what they tell us. These frameworks were adopted by the International Labour Conference and thus represent the views of the tripartite constituents of the ILO's 187 member states. So the ILO Declaration on Fundamental Principles and Rights at Work and its follow-up, adopted in 1998 and amended, in 2022, says that in seeking to maintain the link between social progress and economic growth, the guarantee of fundamental principles and rights at work is of particular significance in that it enables the persons concerned to claim freely and on the basis of equality of opportunity their fair share of the wealth which they have helped to generate and to achieve fully their human potential. And as we discussed yesterday, improved workers' rights have been shown to offer a solid foundation for strong and stable economic growth. This is the type of sustained and sustainable economic growth envisaged in Target 8 of the 2030 Agenda. The ILO Centenary Declaration, adopted in 2019, 19 states that all members should work towards the ratification and implementation of the ILO Fundamental Conventions, and that it is incumbent on the ILO to strengthen the capacity of its tripartite constituents to address all fundamental principles and rights at work at all levels as appropriate, through strong, influential, and inclusive mechanisms of social dialogue. So that being said, what are fundamental labor rights and why are they important? There are 5 fundamental principles and rights at work, 4 that were adopted in the 1998 declaration, and the 5th was added in 2022. So we have first freedom of association and the effective recognition of the right to bargain collectively. Second, the elimination of all forms of forced labor. The third one is the elimination of discrimination in respect of employment and occupation. The fourth one, the abolition of child labor. And the 5th one, a safe and healthy working environment. All these rights are traditionally enshrined in the ILO constitutions, and as such, all ILO members, per their membership to the organization, commit to promote, respect, and realize the fundamental principles and rights at work. So why is this important? First, fundamental principles and rights at work are important at the individual level. At the individual level, they protect the vulnerability of the person against the disproportionate power of the state or commercial interests. And this refers back to the Declaration of Philadelphia that stated that labor is not a commodity. Second, they are important at the national level in that, one, they reduce inequalities. And there we have a quote from the 1998 declaration that reminds us that economic growth is necessary, but not sufficient to ensure equity and eradicate poverty. It is therefore critically important to have strong social policies, social justice, and democratic institutions. And 2, they are important at the national level because they strengthen resilience to crisis, as we learned the hard way through the COVID-19 pandemic. And there we have a quote from the Centenary Declaration that reminds us that representation and dialogue are crucial for a well-functioning and productive economy. And third, fundamental principles and rights at work are important at the global level in that they represent a social floor that guarantees globalization remains fair. As you know, fundamental principles and rights at work are credentials of democratic good governance, which is a source of stability. They underpin the mutual benefit that itself is a cornerstone of trade liberalization. Then trade drives productivity, drives incomes of the population at large, drives export opportunities for higher value-added goods and services. And increasingly, we note that overseas brands are required by home legislation to undertake and publish the results of due diligence on respect for fundamental principles down their supply chains. And there are numerous examples of such national legislation. So what is the situation as far as ratification of fundamental instruments is concerned in the BRICS and generally? This slide shows the 10 fundamental conventions that are linked to the 5 categories and their ratifications as of February 10 this year. And you can see that Convention 182 on the abolition of the worst forms of child labor is universally ratified by the 187 member states. Convention 29 on forced labor is getting close to that with 180 ratifications. The conventions that were more recently upgraded to the status of fundamental instruments, which are Convention 155 on occupational safety and health, and Convention 187 on promotional framework for occupational safety and health, show lower levels of ratification, but we are confident that they will increase quickly now with the new status that they have. In addition to the fundamental conventions, there are 4 governance conventions as per the 1998 declaration amended in 2022. And these are the Labor Inspection Convention, the Employment Policy Convention, the Labor Inspection in Agriculture Convention, and the Tripartite Consultation Convention. This slide shows the ratifications of the fundamental instruments in the BRICS. And you can see that some of the conventions have been ratified by all BRICS countries, actually a majority, and some still need to be ratified by some of the BRICS countries. So to sum up, why is ratification important? Although all members must promote, respect, and realize fundamental principles and rights at work, ratification matters most in the long term. So whether you've ratified or not, you have to promote, realize, and respect these rights. But in the long term, it matters to ratify because it is a sort of safety lock. So if there is a change in the government, for example, or in the approach, the ratification provides this safety lock. It's also important because the ILO offers a single standard and a single objective arbiter rather than different interpretations, and so different standards depending, in the case, for example, of freedom of association and collective bargaining, on the choice of labor relations systems of your bilateral partner. In 2019, at the centenary ILC, there was a reaffirmation that ILO is the arbiter based on 100 years of experience and not other institutions such as the WTO, for example. It's also important to ratify because you involve labor market actors in the national debate on the application of international standards, and this dialogue is important for social cohesion. It also matters increasingly as a political and economic business card. And finally, it matters because the International Labour Conference has called for the universal ratification of fundamental conventions at the centenary ILC. Now let me turn to some policy considerations on how to protect and advance labour rights in your countries. Freedom of association and the effective recognition of the right to collective bargaining are foundational rights that are indispensable for the realization of the other 4 categories. So what are the main elements of a conducive and enabling environment for freedom of association and collective bargaining? Essentially, there are 3 main elements. First, an effective legal and institutional framework for labor relations with meaningful participation in the governance of the labor market and ownership of its outcomes. And this requires strong employers and workers' organizations. And the third element is an efficient labor administration that provides for labor inspection and professional dispute settlement services. On forced labor, a broad-based approach is needed to eliminate all forms of forced or compulsory labor. Here, let me just remind you that the fundamental instruments establish an ambiguous principle. It is that the exaction of forced labor is a crime and that it must be dealt with as such. So one element to address forced labor is a criminal law enforcement. That's very important, but it's not enough. And we need a broader approach which includes preventing and addressing root causes of forced labor, and ensuring protection and remedies for the people already affected by it. And these two elements, I will not go into the details now for the sake of time, but are crucially important in addressing forced labor. On the effective abolition of forced labor, here again, we've listed three key elements to take into account. First, of course, to adopt laws and regulations to protect children, so good legal and regulatory frameworks to protect children. Second, to establish enforcement and child protection systems to apply this regulatory framework and this legal framework. So the actual enforcement of the law. And third, and probably what we might discuss a lot today, is to address the main underlying drivers of child labor. And here the Durban call to action on the elimination of child labor, adopted at the 5th Global Conference held in Durban in May 2022, provides a critical roadmap for global efforts. It centers around 6 broad lines that seek to address the main underlying drivers of child labor, of which I will just cite a few, such as the lack of social protection, the lack of free quality education, the lack of decent work for those above the minimum working age. And so the Durban call to action actually provides a good roadmap to address these underlying drivers that might inspire your national action. On the elimination of discrimination in respect of employment and occupation, here let me say that discrimination can take many forms, both in terms of gaining access to employment and in the treatment of employees once they are in work. It may be direct discrimination, such as when laws, rules, or practices explicitly cite a reason, such as sex or race, to deny equal opportunity. So the first level of action is to adopt laws that forbid discrimination and establish institutions that prevent and offer remedies. Most commonly, however, discrimination is indirect and arises where rules or practices that have the appearance of neutrality in fact lead to exclusion. This indirect discrimination often exists informally in attitudes and in practices, which, if unchallenged, can perpetuate in organizations. This is why it is important to allocate adequate human and financial resources to keep the law and the institutions functioning efficiently. Labor inspectors, judges, public officials, and other competent authorities need to have the necessary knowledge and adequate institutional capacity when they attempt to identify and address discrimination cases. This will then help victims of discrimination submitting their claims successfully. Discrimination may also have cultural roots that demand more specific approaches. Political will is critical to advance the non-discrimination agenda, recognizing that much discrimination has deep-rooted historical and cultural origins and cannot be tackled with laws alone. This is in fact why many countries have advanced to establishing equal opportunity commissions with a range of advisory, mediating, advocacy, and other functions. And finally, a safe and healthy working environment. Here also, what matters is to have an effective governance of occupational safety and health, with the development of national policy and regulatory frameworks that define responsibilities in keeping working environments healthy and safe, that involve the social partners, that provide effective advisory and enforcement mechanisms, And also, and this is something that has been discussed in the BRICS before, I think it was under the Russian presidency, the need to put in place a preventative occupational safety and health culture. Another element which is very important is to have adequate investment in national OSH infrastructures. And that means investing in all the different elements of the national infrastructure and to think of the system as a whole. So not investing only in modernizing the national legal framework or a specific policy, but think of the national infrastructure of OSH as a system where we have to invest in all the different elements. The national regulatory policy, the institutional framework, the structures of social dialogue, and the OSH services that are offered. And finally, it's important to have workplace-level interventions adapted to the specificities of the sectors and workforces that we are aiming to protect. I will stop here, Chair, with your permission. Thank you.